My name is Lance, and I've worked as an investigative journalist for nearly a decade. I've covered everything from political scandals to forgotten wars, but nothing could have prepared me for what I found in that village. It all started with a string of disappearances. People vanishing without a trace. At first it seemed like a sensationalist story, the kind of thing a local tabloid would publish to sell more issues. But the more I investigated, the more the name Wendigo kept coming up. An ancient legend. Something I should have ignored. The village was small, hidden between mountains. When I arrived, I was met with a palpable sense of distrust. The few people who still ventured out of their homes avoided looking me in the eye. It didn't take long to realize how closed off they were. It was as if I had stepped into a place frozen in time. Everything smelled of mold and old wood, as if the very earth was decaying along with those people. That's when I met Henry, an old man with white hair and trembling hands, but a hardened expression, etched with years of secrets no one else wanted to hear. He approached me after seeing me wandering the village, trying to strike up conversation with the locals. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The Wendigo is still hungry." I laughed. Wendigo? That story about a cannibalistic creature that devours human flesh and roams remote forests? But Henry wasn't laughing. He pulled me aside, his eyes scanning the shadows as if he expected something to leap out at any moment. "They believe," he continued. "They believe that the Wendigo's hunger is what took the missing people. But it's not just a creature. The Wendigo's hunger is inside people." I'll admit, at that moment, a chill ran down my spine. Something about the way he spoke, the low, urgent tone of his voice, made me think that he truly believed it. And maybe, just maybe, I should believe it too. The first few nights in the village were terrible. The wind howled through the trees like a distant scream, and I swear, at times I heard whispers coming from outside my window. Whispers that echoed in the darkness. I tried convincing myself it was just the wind or my tired mind playing tricks on me, but then the visions began. On the second night, I woke in the middle of the night, drenched in cold sweat. I looked out the window, and in the mist that blanketed the village, I saw a shadow moving between the trees. It was quick, agile, but what froze me in place was the way it stared at me. A deep, hollow gaze. I stood there, motionless, feeling my heart hammer in my chest as that thing disappeared into the darkness, as if it had never been there. The worst came later. The dreams. Dreams where I was trapped in the forest, lost, with something following me. I would run, but I could never escape. I always heard that heavy, hungry breathing behind me, and it always ended with that thing, the Wendigo, too close for comfort. When I spoke to Henry the next day, he looked at me with a mix of pity and fear. "It's seen you," he said. "Now, you can't turn back." That's when he told me the truth. The disappearances, it wasn't the Wendigo itself. It was the villagers. They were performing rituals, sacrifices. They believed that by offering human lives, they could appease the Wendigo's spirit, keep it at bay. The hunger, Henry said, was contagious. Once someone came into contact with the Wendigo's presence, the hunger became part of them, and it never stopped. That same night, I decided I was leaving. It was already late, and the forest felt even denser, as if the air around me had thickened, grown heavier. But I had no choice. I had to get out. That's when I stumbled upon them. It was a clearing, and at the center, a ritual. Men and women, the same ones who had ignored me in the days prior, were there. In their hands, blades, and before them, a body, still alive, bound and groaning. That sound, the sound of pure desperation, it's something I'll never forget. My heart raced. They saw me, and in that moment, I knew I was no longer just an investigative journalist. I was the next victim. I ran like never before. I could hear their footsteps behind me, the rustling of leaves, the sound of their feet pounding the damp ground. Panic took over, and the only thought in my mind was, survive. I managed to escape, but not unscathed. When I finally emerged from the forest, when I left that cursed village behind, something had changed. It wasn't just the memory of what I had seen or the whispers that still echoed in my mind. It was something deeper. I could feel it, inside me. The hunger. The next few days were a blur. Back in the city, I tried to reconnect with the real world, to tell the story to anyone who would listen, but the words just wouldn't come. Every time I tried to speak, something inside me held me back. It was as if the truth was trapped, suffocated, and with it, something else. My name is Margot, and I've been a psychologist for over 15 years. I always believed that I understood the human mind. Distorted thoughts, traumas, phobias, they were always my targets of study, and over time, I learned how to deal with people's inner monsters. But nothing could have prepared me for the horrors I was about to face. It all started when I was called to a psychiatric center in a remote village, surrounded by a dense, suffocating forest. The patients were exhibiting peculiar behaviors, almost as if they were part of a collective delusion. They spoke of an ancient creature, an entity from the forest that promised to free them from their pain. The name always came up: Wendigo. At first, I thought it was just another legend they had adopted to personify their traumas, a defense mechanism perhaps. But the more I listened, the more unsettled I became. Daniel, one of the patients, was the most disturbed. He spoke about the Wendigo as if it were a real presence, something he could see, feel, touch. During one of our sessions, his screams of terror echoed through the halls of the center. He's coming for us. I should have left right then. Something inside me was screaming to stop investigating, but against my instincts, I delved deeper. As the days passed, I began to notice subtle changes in the patients. Some became more distant, others with vacant stares and smiles that didn't match the despair I had seen in them before. But the scariest thing was that I started to change as well. I began waking up in the middle of the night, hearing whispers that seemed to come from everywhere. Sometimes it was just the wind, but other times it felt like someone was calling my name. The hallucinations grew more intense. I saw a tall, thin, skeletal figure with eyes that gleamed in the darkness. It never came close, but I knew it was there, watching, waiting. I started to question my own sanity. I no longer knew if the patients were truly delusional or if something far worse was happening. It was as if the psychiatric center and the forest around it were one, connected by an ancient malevolent energy, something I couldn't explain but could feel seeping into every crack of my mind. With each session with Daniel, the tension grew. He spoke in a low, confident tone, as if he knew something I didn't. He told me about ancient rituals, about how the Wendigo promised to free people from their pain, from their torments, but at a cost. "He offers you peace, Margot," Daniel whispered. "He can take away all the weight you carry, but you'll have to sacrifice something in return." Those words stuck with me. I tried to ignore them, to rationalize them, but the truth was that the Wendigo wasn't just a legend to those patients. It was a real force, something that consumed them from the inside out. And little by little, I felt myself being pulled into the same abyss. Everything culminated in one horrific night. I received a call from the center's nurses. Daniel had disappeared. They said he fled into the forest, and something inside me knew I had to follow him. I don't know why, but there was an urgency. It was as if somehow my own sanity depended on it. The forest felt alive, pulsing with an invisible presence. With each step I took, the whispers grew louder, as if something was circling me. My heart raced, and fear coursed through my veins like poison. Finally, I found Daniel, but he was no longer the man I once knew. His skin was pale, his bones protruding, and his eyes, they were empty, soulless, inhuman. He was in the midst of his transformation. He had become a Wendigo. I knew that the moment of decision had arrived. I could try to save Daniel, try to bring him back, or I could surrender to the Wendigo's promise, the promise to take away all the pain I carried inside. In that instant, I realized something terrifying. The Wendigo wasn't just a creature that devoured flesh. It devoured what people most wanted to get rid of. It fed on our weaknesses, our fears, our deepest pains. And I had so many pains. Losses I had never overcome, traumas I had never resolved. It knew that. It was offering me a way out. But I couldn't give in. With all the strength I had left, I fought against the temptation. I screamed at Daniel to fight too, but he was already too far gone. The Wendigo had consumed him completely. And then, in an act of desperation, I managed to free the other patients, driving away the Wendigo's influence from them. But I couldn't save Daniel. He was lost to the darkness of the forest forever. Now, back at the center, the village feels calmer. as if the presence that once weighed on everything has lessened. But for me, things will never be the same. I left the forest knowing that the Wendigo wasn't just a legend. It was a symbol of something much deeper, something that exists inside all of us. My name is William, and I've been a musician for over 10 years, always searching for something new, something that transcended the ordinary. What happened to me, I never imagined it could be real. I always thought these were just stories, legends. But here I am, telling something no one will believe. Well, that is, if I'm still here when you hear this. I came to this isolated village seeking inspiration. I needed something profound for my next album, something beyond the usual. My music had dried up, and the pressure to create something memorable was suffocating. Someone told me about this small village in the mountains, where old legends seemed never to die. That's what drew me in. I thought I could channel the energy of these stories, bring a mystical touch to my music. But what I found was much more than I bargained for. Within the first few days, I heard his name. Wendigo. People whispered it as if the very air around them could grow heavy just from mentioning it. They told me he was the personification of eternal hunger, of human greed, an ancient spirit that corrupted those who dared seek more than they needed. A fascinating legend, perfect for my new composition. Everyone I interviewed repeated the same warnings. Don't mess with it. Don't go after him. But that only pushed me further. I needed to capture the essence of this story, of this invisible terror that kept the village chained to fear. That's when I began composing. At first, everything seemed normal, but then the dreams began. I heard a song, a melody that seemed to come from nowhere. It wasn't my music. It was something different, hypnotic. It was soft, but with a disturbing dissonance, as if each note was on the verge of breaking. I woke up with it resonating in my mind, and the more I tried to compose it, the more it became my obsession. At night, it felt like something was calling me. I would leave the house, walking through the forest with my head full of melodies and distorted visions. On one of those nights, I followed the music to a place no one should ever see. In the middle of the forest, I found an altar. Bones, pieces of dried flesh, rotting offerings, a grotesque scene. And around this altar, a figure, tall, disfigured, dancing erratically as if it were part of the melody now pulsing in my head. I should have run, but I stayed. The music, the damned music, wouldn't let me go. It was like each chord tied me more and more. And there, among the twisted branches and the stench of death, I knew. He wasn't just a legend. The Wendigo was there, alive, starving. When he finally turned to me, I saw the emptiness in his eyes, the insatiable hunger that would never be quenched. He didn't physically attack me, not yet, but he didn't need to. The truth is, the music, the song I was composing, was his. I was creating something that would bring him back, something that would feed him. The Wendigo doesn't devour bodies. He devours souls, hopes, ambitions. Every note I played, every chord, was a piece of me that he ripped away. That's when it all made sense. I wasn't composing for myself, I was composing for him. At the climax of this madness, I faced a choice. Finish the composition and complete the work, or destroy everything. If I finished, he promised me success, eternal recognition, but the price would be my very soul. If I destroyed it, he would leave me, but not without a cost. I didn't know what that cost would be, but the fear of eternity by his side was unbearable. I destroyed the music, burned every sheet of paper, every written melody. I tore the strings from my guitar, threw the ashes into the wind. But the sense of relief never came. The Wendigo didn't disappear. He lingered at the edge of my vision, like a twisted shadow, watching, waiting. I returned to the house where I was staying, with the feeling that something was following me. The silence of the village enveloped me like a suffocating shroud, and every step echoed in the darkness. I closed the door behind me, locked it, tried to turn on a light, but nothing worked. The electricity failed. There was only darkness. And then I heard it, the damned song, that hypnotic melody that never left me. Even without instruments, even without sheet music, it was there, vibrating in the air like a living presence. My ears throbbed, my head felt like it was about to explode. I knew he was getting closer, and I had nothing left to destroy. Desperate, I began screaming, begging him to leave me alone. I asked for forgiveness, pleaded for anything to give me more time. But he didn't want forgiveness. He never did. The Wendigo wanted what he always wanted, my soul. And he was devouring it slowly, piece by piece. The air grew dense, cold. A smell of rotting flesh filled the room, almost making me vomit. The shadows on the walls began to move, twisting, taking shape. And then he appeared. Taller, more deformed than I remembered. His eyes were an endless void, an abyss of hunger, and at the center of that void was the certainty of my fate. "You can't escape what you started, William," he whispered, his voice echoing inside my head. I tried to run, but my body no longer obeyed me. I was frozen in place, my eyes fixed on that horrible figure. It was as if my legs were part of the ground. He approached slowly, each step a crushing weight on my soul. Each prolonged second was torture. I felt my sanity slipping through my fingers. He extended his skeletal hand, his long, twisted fingers touching my chest. An intense cold overtook me. My vision darkened, and the pain was indescribable. It was as if he was tearing my spirit apart, piece by piece, ripping everything I was, leaving only an empty shell. There was no scream I could release. There was no air left to breathe. The last thing I heard was that damned song, echoing in my mind, louder than ever. The same melody I thought I had destroyed was now destroying me. My vision blurred, and before the darkness consumed me completely, I knew. He had won. When they find me, if they find me, there won't be much left of me. Maybe just a body without a soul, without will. Maybe just a distant whisper, lost in the forests where the hunger of the Wendigo always remains. I am just another sacrifice. Another victim. The Wendigo hasn't left, he never leaves, and now he carries me with him into eternity. I still remember the smell of old paper mixed with mildew that permeated every corner of that house. A grand old mansion, abandoned for decades, yet still standing, as if it held secrets that no one dared to unearth. I was there to investigate my family's history. They said we were descendants of cursed people, but I never paid much attention to those stories until that night. The weather was dreadful, as if the sky itself was trying to warn me to leave. The rain hammered against the windows, and the wind howled like a distant lament. But I was already immersed in the diaries I found in the attic, old and worn, with stained pages, not just from time, but something more. Something that felt like tears. In the words of my ancestor, I read about a hunger that never ceased, a desperation that transformed man into something more, something monstrous. It was a legend, or at least I thought it was. As the storm intensified, I began to hear whispers. They were soft at first, almost imperceptible, but soon became impossible to ignore. They came from below, from the basement. Every fiber of my being screamed for me not to go, to leave those voices alone, but curiosity, or perhaps fate, forced me to descend. The basement was even colder than the rest of the house, as if time had stopped there. In the center, I found an altar. It was not just a relic of ancient rituals. It was something alive, pulsating with an energy that made the air vibrate. I could feel a presence approaching, as if it had been summoned by something deep within me. And it was there, in that basement, that I realized the truth. The Wendigo, the monster of hunger and despair, was connected to my family, and now connected to me. My heart raced. The darkness around seemed to take shape, and suddenly it was there, a tall, hungry shadow with eyes that seemed to pierce my soul. I felt its hunger. It wasn't just for flesh, it was for pain, for everything I had been carrying for so long. The Wendigo didn't attack me. Not immediately. It whispered, in a voice that sounded almost human, almost understanding. "I know your pain, Marta. I can take it away from you. I can end your suffering, your loneliness." The temptation was overwhelming. The pain I carried was almost unbearable. All my losses, my disappointments, everything seemed to pile up at once, and he knew. The Wendigo knew. He offered me an escape, a relief, but at a terrible cost. I would have to surrender, give up my humanity, join him in eternal hunger. Somehow, I knew there was no turning back. As he spoke, I began to remember. Remember how easy it was to forget the faces of the people I had lost. Remember how easy it was to blame the world for the wounds that never healed. The Wendigo offered something that, in that moment, seemed irresistible. It wasn't just an escape from pain. It was a rebirth, a way to transform everything that consumed me. What shocked me was realizing that I didn't want to resist. At the climax, what happened next wasn't a struggle. There were no desperate screams, no frantic running. I looked at that creature, and all I felt was a strange acceptance. I wanted it. I wanted to free myself, from my fears, from my loneliness. The Wendigo didn't need to convince me. I was already ready. He moved closer, his presence dominating the small space. I extended my hand, and when our fingers touched, I felt the hunger spread through me. It was warm, overwhelming, like a devouring fire that burned everything in its path. And instead of recoiling, I surrendered. The transformation wasn't painful, not in a physical sense. It was as if my spirit was being molded, twisted until nothing remained of the woman I once was. My body changed, my bones cracked, but all I felt was relief. An indescribable relief. When I finally looked at my reflection in a broken mirror in the corner of the basement, I saw what I had become. Tall, skeletal, with eyes that now glowed in the dark. I was a Wendigo, and for the first time in years, I was at peace. I left the house. The storm had subsided, and the silence of the night enveloped me like a familiar embrace. I could feel the world in a new way. Every heartbeat in the houses around, every hidden fear in the shadows. The hunger was there, always present, but now it was my companion. I was no longer the curious historian who entered that house. I became the legend, and I liked it. I will never forget that night. It was supposed to be just another outing. My friends and I in the middle of the woods, camping, drinking, laughing, telling scary stories to pass the time. That playful atmosphere, you know? But there's something they always say about the forest. You don't mess with what you don't understand. The laughter began to fade as night fell. Someone, I think it was Leo, brought up the idea of the Wendigo. Have you heard of it? The Wendigo. That creature that feeds on human hunger, that transforms people into monsters ravenous for flesh. Of course, no one took it seriously. Just another legend to scare us. The truth is, in that forest, the legend was much more alive than we imagined. Hours passed and the mood shifted. The campfire, which had seemed cozy, now barely illuminated the trees around us. Fog began to creep in, and every sound in the woods, every crack of a branch, felt closer. And then, the first strange thing happened. Henrique disappeared. We thought he was just playing a trick, hiding to scare us, but minutes turned into hours, and he didn't return. Concern began to grow. We walked through the forest calling his name, but all we received in response was silence. A heavy silence, almost oppressive. No one wanted to admit it, but we started to feel that something was watching us. That first night, I dreamed of him, Henrique, or what he used to be. In the dream, he was by the campfire, looking at me with hollow eyes, skin stretched tight over bones. His mouth was filthy, covered in dried blood. He whispered my name, but the sound that came out was not human. And then, he smiled, a smile that sent a deep chill through my soul. I woke up gasping, drenched in cold sweat. I looked around. My friends were still sleeping, but something was wrong. Someone was missing. Lara. That's when everything started to crumble. Panic set in. The jokes had died along with Henrique and Lara. Now, only fear remained. I tried to convince everyone to leave, to head back down the trail, to seek help, but it felt like every time we tried to move away, something pulled us back. It was as if the forest were alive, trapping us. Despair took hold, and the shadows around us grew denser, more suffocating. I saw Henrique again. But this time, I was awake. He emerged between the trees, staggering, his body deformed, emaciated, but now more agile, more predatory. He was no longer our friend. His eyes glimmered with hunger, and the distorted smile was etched on his face. He looked at me, and a voice, that same voice I heard in the dream, echoed in my mind. You're hungry too, Joshua. I can feel it. You just need to give in. My skin prickled. The cold inside me was unbearable. It wasn't an invitation, it was a promise. The Wendigo was toying with me, playing with my fear, trying to bend me, to make me submit. That night, Leo disappeared, and we knew. Knew he had been taken, consumed by that thing. Each one of us was marked. The climax came suddenly, brutally. I found myself alone. My friends were no longer my friends. They were transforming, one by one. Whatever was pursuing us was feeding not only on our flesh, but on our pain, the fear that was destroying us from within. It was then that I saw Henrique, or what he had become, for the last time. He stood in the middle of a clearing, his thin, twisted body, pale skin stained with blood. He reached out his hand to me, and I felt something inside me break. The creature didn't need to kill me. Not yet. It just needed me to accept what it offered, an escape. A way to flee from the pain. The suffering ends if you accept, you will be free. For a moment, just for a moment, I considered it. The cold, the fear, the imminent death. Everything could end if I simply gave up. But then I remembered who I was. What Henrique had been. I couldn't let myself be consumed by that. I couldn't become what he had turned into. In a desperate act, I attacked. I grabbed the first branch I found and lunged at him, screaming as if my very life depended on it. And it did. I managed to strike his thin body. A dry, horrifying sound echoed as the branch broke against his skin. He recoiled, screaming in a voice that was not human, but I knew that wouldn't stop him. Not for long, but I had done what I needed. I survived. For now, with my lungs burning and my heart pounding in my throat, I fled the clearing. I ran without looking back. The sound of his footsteps echoed, but gradually it faded until only silence remained. The forest was never the same for me again. The world was never the same. I survived, but not without scars. The hunger, the pain, the whispers, they are still with me. I don't know how much longer I can hold on.